Hello folks, Scott here with the new Hero Studio Card Kit of the Month for April of 2025. This month's kit is called Terrarium and features a great set of terrarium stamps. Our big 6x8 stamp set is this fun terrarium stamp set with like the whole terrarium over here, lots of other features to go inside your terrarium. That looks like a pothos to me. Lots of leaves. There's some rocks with moss, mushrooms, a little frog with holding a leaf over his head, more mushrooms, some rocks, and a big stump over here. There's 6 sentiments here. I'm here for you, rain or shine, plant dreams, pull weeds, and grow a happy life. You are magical. Sending happy thoughts, thinking of you, and thank you. Always useful thank you cards. That's our 6x8 stamp set. And of course, we get 16 coordinating dies. They not only cut out the large stamp, terrarium stamp, but all of the other pieces and all of the sentiments as well. 16 coordinating die cuts. Then we get 20 terrarium fancy dies. 20 terrarium fancy dies. This is obviously our terrarium shape right here. That fits beautifully right on top of our terrarium stamp. But these are all fancy dies. So there's the base of the terrarium. We also have, this looks like rocks and soil, flowers. There's a stump with some detail, rocks with detail. We've got mushrooms with detail, a butterfly with detail, ferns, moss, leaves, of course, these little fiddly ferns. Everybody loves those. And a big pothos leaf. I'm not sure if that's right. And then we get 9 sheets of cardstock. These are half sheets of cardstock, so they're 5.5 by 8.5. And our colors this month are Poppy, and Peridot, and Rainforest, Fern, Alabaster, Fawn, Truffle, Fog, and finally Anchor. Really nice colors. Has worked great with all of our fancy dies this month. And then we also get 3 A2 panels of clear acetate. If you want to make your terrarium a shaker card, or if you just want to create the illusion that your terrarium is behind glass, 3 A2 panels of clear acetate comes in the kit. And then last but not least, we also get some clear enamel dots. Love these clear enamel dots. Obviously, we can put little dewdrops inside our terrarium, put them actually on the terrarium casing. That's everything in the Hero Studio Card Kit of the Month for April of 2025. This looks like lots of fun. Of course, we have ample chances to color, some great paper piecing that we can do. Let's make some terrariums. And here we have our 10 cards for the month. We got all white card bases. Looks like there's one ivory card base in the mix there. I was looking forward to coloring these stamps, so I began by stamping all of the stamps with Versamark Onyx Black ink on some Bristol Smooth cardstock to color with my Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers. And I stamped another batch on some Stonehenge white cardstock for coloring with my colored pencils. And of course, I began with that big terrarium stamp, and we've got our Sending Happy Thoughts terrarium with you. And see, they've got that nice dome over the top of it. There's lots of detail on this stamp, but if you take it plant by plant, it's fairly easy to differentiate all the flora from each other. So on the front of an A2 white card base, I die cut the domed opening and lightly blended Hero Art Splash Reactive ink around the sides and top. I die cut the colored stamp and glued it in place on an A2 panel of white cardstock. Again, that stamp is stamped on Bristol Smooth cardstock and colored with my Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers. I stamped the sentiment with some VersaFine ink and embossed it with clear embossing powder. And then I glued one of the clear acetate panels on top and glued those to the back of the die-cut card base, centering the stamp in the arched opening. I did trim the panel to fit, just a little bit on the inside so that the card would close nicely. I die-cut the terrarium base from a scrap of wood-grained dark green cardstock. This was actually some cardstock from the My Monthly Hero September of 2019 kit. You can see that nice wood grain on that. I highlighted the texture of that with a little white crayon before gluing it down to the base. Now that's a bit of a tight fit to get everything to fit on the front of an A2 card. Now I did toy with adding some of the other smaller images to the terrarium, but I don't much care for the white borders the coordinating dies leave and trying to hide them or worse, cut them away. And I thought a lot of the individual images were a little out of scale for a terrarium of this size. Still, it's an adorable and verdant little terrarium. Sending happy thoughts. I love the acetate over the front of that. It looks like a little domed terrarium. So I wanted to use all of the other images in the stamp set, so I did go ahead and color all of the smaller images with my Zig markers, and I dutifully die cut everything out. Of course, everyone's going to put the frog on the tree stump, but I was more interested in the crack of the stump and what might be growing out of that. And that leads us to You Are Magical, with that great pothos. I'm going to call that a pothos plant. That great pothos growing out of the crack in that trunk. I decided to use the terrarium stamp for a little bit of background. So I stamped that on a panel of white cardstock with some Hero Arts Fog reactive ink, and I did some soft blending on the bottom of the panel with that same ink. Now, when I glue a couple of die-cut images together, I like to trim away the white border only where the images overlap. I trimmed the border away from the plant only where it sits on top of the stump. And I trimmed away the border on the rocks where they are in front of the mushrooms. That gives me a seamless coupling without having to fussy cut the whole image. I cut a small slit in the trunk to plant the pothos, and I glued the shrooms to the back of the rocks. Now, I die cut the stamped panel with a 3¼ inch by 4½ inch Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die. I added a thin green mat behind that, just plain green cardstock from my stash. This is like as green as you can possibly get, just green. I stamped the sentiment with Hero Arts Apple Green reactive ink and embossed that with clear embossing powder. I arranged the images on top and I glued them directly to the card front. Now, I did fussy cut the single pothos leaf, and I added that to the plant with some foam tape for some added dimension. I colored in the mushroom dots with a sparkle gel pen. That single leaf actually adds a great amount of depth, and I love the plant growing out of that trunk. So we've got a few little clear dots highlighting the sentiment up there. You are magical. Okay, so that leaves me with the large moss-covered rocks, the frog, and the small mushrooms. Well, frogs sit on rocks, don't they? And we have our I'm Here For You, Rain or Shine. I glued the frog to the rocks. I just cut away the small seedlings on top of the rocks, and I trimmed the white border on the frog where he overlaps with the rock. You can see that. It almost looks like both pieces were die cut as one. I die cut a scrap of white cardstock with a 2¾ inch by 4 inch Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die, and I ink blended some clouds across the top with a My Favorite Things mini cloud edges stencil and some splash reactive ink. I stamped the sentiment with VersaFine ink, and I embossed it with some clear embossing powder. Then I added a thin black mat and a thicker green mat. There's that same green cardstock before gluing both to a white card base. I added the frog and rocks using foam tape, and I added a couple of clear hero enamel dots to the leaf. One drop is precariously perched on the tip of the leaf, ready to roll off. Oh, I do really love that frog. I wish there were a few more critters in this kit. So let's turn to my Prismacolor colored pencils and all of the images that I stamped on the Stonehenge white cardstock. And of course, I started with the big terrarium stamp first. And we have Plant Dreams, Pull Weeds, and Grow a Happy Life. This is a little bit less intense coloring than the Zig markers afford, but it's every bit as verdant. I don't know which one I like better. I think I actually have more greens in my colored pencils than I do in my Zig markers. I think that gives us a little bit more variety of greens here. I also used Gamsol and a blending stump to help blend the colored pencils. I forget how well Gamsol works. Love that. I die cut the colored terrarium, added some light blue to the white spaces to help it blend into the background. The background dome is actually the one I cut from our first card. It already had some splash reactive ink blended on it. I stamped the sentiment with VersaFine Onyx Black ink on a scrap of white cardstock ink blended with more splash ink, and I die cut it with the matching die. I die cut the terrarium base for some black wood grain cardstock. Again, this is from that same My Monthly Hero September 2019 kit, and I trimmed off the top scalloped layer. It's a little simpler of a base, and it takes up a little less room as well. I glued the colored stamp to the dome background and the base to the bottom, glued them all to the front of a white card base. I added the sentiment with foam tape. You know, that is kind of a wacky sentiment. And instead of acetate, I added 3 graduated clear dots to the top edge of the dome. A suggestion of glass or maybe moisture without using up my precious acetate sheets. I like this coloring so much. I didn't even think about adding any of the smaller images. This looks like a pretty busy terrarium as is. Now, of course, I couldn't avoid putting that frog on the tree stump, but I thought I'd be much happier using some fussy cut masking to stamp a little vignette instead of having to resort to the matching dies. And that gives us a Miss You card with this fun little vignette. First, I stamped the frog on a panel of Stonehenge white cardstock, and I stamped the same on a piece of masking paper and fussy cut it out. I didn't have to fussy cut the entire thing. I just fussy cut the sides where he was going to overlap. So I covered the frog with the masking, and I stamped the tree stump along with another on more masking paper so that I could then mask off the tree stump. And again, I only fussy cut the edges of the tree stump that needed to be cut away. Nothing's being stamped on these sides. Then it was a simple matter of stamping the pothos plants and the mushroom, remove the 2 masks, and voila! A sweet little vignette. I colored everything with my Prismacolor colored pencils, and I used Gamsol for blending. There's lots of shades of green here. The moss is different from the pothos, is different from the frog, and even his leaf is just a little bit different. Now, I dug around in my stash for this sentiment. This is actually from the Hero Arts, old Hero Arts Many Everyday Messages stamp set. And I stamped that in VersaFine Onyx Black ink and embossed it with clear embossing powder. I die cut the panel with a Simon Says stamp modern postage stamp rectangle, and I glued it to a 4 3/4 by 3.5 inch Peridot mask from the kit. This is that Peridot cardstock from our kit, and then glued those down to a white card base. The vignette seemed a little stark against the pure white cardstock, so I reached for my Pebbles chalk palette and blended a soft green haze around the scene. Very soft. You can see it, but you can't really see it. I think that anchors everything quite nicely. And that frog, he really does look like he's missing someone. Miss you. So that actually covers all of the image stamps from our stamp set. We've got a couple more sentiments to use yet, but I figured it's time to dive into the terrarium fancy dies. Now, personally, I'd rather color than die cut. I do get a little anxious about coloring or shading die cuts. I just don't think I'm very good at that. But I went ahead and I die cut all the fancy dies and I glued the layering pieces together. Now, as far as die cuts go, I'm always at odds over whether to cut them from white cardstock and color the shapes, or color white cardstock first and then die cut the shapes, or die cut from colored cardstock and add shading. So since we have so much colored cardstock in this kit, I decided on the latter technique. And yes, the lighter stones on the darker soil are paper pieced on top. I managed to save every single one of those stones. And that brings us to a Thinking of You card. And now, on the large fern here, I actually started with my Ahuhu alcohol markers. It's not as perfect of a blend as I might have wanted, but it is serviceable. Now, for the rest of the greenery and the stump, I ink blended green apple and vintage photo distress oxide ink on them with blending brushes or foam pads. Now, I do like that the rocks, because they're glued on top, catch the ink blending just perfectly. Really good dimension there. Lastly, I die cut the dome from some Hero Hues Mist cardstock. Now, I liked that the large fern seemed very happy on the right side of the dome background, so I arranged everything around that and stamped the sentiment using vintage photo distress oxide ink and embossed that with clear embossing powder. Can you see that? Oh, there you go. Now for the butterfly, I took a small paintbrush, a very small paintbrush, and some white gouache watercolors and painted in the dots on the edges. Ooh, baby, that certainly brought that butterfly to life. I also blended in some orange chalk pastels close to the body and just wiped the excess off of the black. That's a nice subtle blend, very subtle. I glued everything together and down to the dome die cut, and I added a couple pieces of scrap cardstock behind the top of the stump to keep it level. I mounted the butterfly with foam tape and decided to add a kind of mat behind the dome. I die cut a piece of fog cardstock from the kit with a 3 3/4 by 5 inch Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die and glued that to a white card base, then glued the dome with the assembled die cuts on top. I love that butterfly, and you know, the clean and simple graphic nature of the die cuts are really wonderful. This is not necessarily even a terrarium. Thinking of you. After fussing with painting these little bitty white dots on the butterfly, I figured there had to be a better way. So I die cut the butterfly background from fog cardstock in the kit. I layered that with the black detail die cut and marked where the dots were. Then it was pretty simple to color in the rest of the wings and the body with my alcohol markers and just leave the edge white. I think that worked extremely well, and it was pretty simple to boot. Now, the stamps and dies in this kit are obviously intended for portrait-oriented cards. Now, I've got to mix it up a little and try to expand the horizons of this kit with a landscape-oriented card. And that gives us, on this ivory cardstock, a Cultivate Kindness card and a nice landscape arrangement. So I did some partial die cutting to extend this ground cover to 4.5 inches long. That's perfect to anchor our landscape arrangement. I also realized that the die cut negatives from the fancy dies would make great stencils. So there you can see, I used these to stencil with. On an A2 panel of white cardstock, I stenciled in the two ferns a few times on the left with Hero Arts Fog and Key Lime Fizz reactive inks in a nice little grouping that will fill in behind our die cuts perfectly. I ink blended Vintage Photo on all of the greenery die cuts for a little touch of shading, and then I decided on an arrangement and turned to my printer for this sentiment. I used my Silhouette software and the Dream State font to print this sentiment on that panel. I trimmed the panel to 4 inches by 5¼ inches with my Tim Holtz Decal Guillotine paper cutter, which I just treated myself to a couple of weeks ago. It has this nice decal edge to it right there. I love decal edge. Figured I could spring for that guillotine cutter and be able to make a deckled edge panel any size I want. I lightly ink blended some Forest Moss Distress Oxide ink around the edges of that panel. I glued the printed and stenciled panel to a white A2 card base and started gluing down the die cuts. The small pothos leaf and the ends of the fiddle fern dies are mounted with little strips of foam tape, as well as the butterfly, of course. A few clear dots to highlight the sentiment, and I used the Hero Arts Spring Enamel dots. These were from the My Monthly Hero April 22 kit on the big leaves. There are actual drop-shaped and oval dots in this pack. So I used an oval dot on the big leaf there, and then both of these on the ends of the leaves are little drip dots. Finally, I colored some tiny gems with an alcohol marker, colored them black to use as flower centers. I think the stenciling adds so much to the die cuts. This feels like a really full arrangement, and I love that sentiment. Cultivate kindness. So beyond the butterfly dies, which there are 2 of them, I think my favorite dies are the mushroom dies. I love that they come in 2 pieces as well. And that gives us, if mushrooms can grow from crap, so can we. It's a unique encouragement card and a good reminder for all of us. I die cut the largest mossy ground cover die from the truffle cardstock in the kit. How appropriate. And I colored it with my Ahuhu alcohol markers. Now, I do find that coloring die cuts with alcohol markers usually works better for me when I stipple in assorted colors. Less of a blending and more of a texturing with colors. I also did some light blending on the underside of the mushrooms with my Pebbles chalk palette. The die cut ground cover measures at 2 inches across, so I masked out a 2-inch square in the center of an A2 card panel, and I ink blended some splash reactive ink inside that square to ground our image. Of course, I faded that out as we got to the top. I used my Silhouette software and the Take Charge font to print this sentiment in brown around the splash square. Then I die cut the panel with a 3¼ inch by 4½ inch Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die and added a thin mat of the poppy cardstock. I want that to match the mushrooms. I glued that to an A2 white card base and I glued the die cuts in place. I did add scraps of cardstock between the tops of the 2 front mushrooms to help keep them level. Some mushrooms are actually cultivated on dung, and most all mushrooms grow from some form of rotting organic decay. Crap is a nice way of saying that. And if mushrooms can flourish in that kind of an environment, then I think we can too. And since this is a printed sentiment, you can easily swap out the we for you if you want this to be a little more personal. If mushrooms can grow from crap, so can you. I'm sorry your situation sucks. Here's some happy mushrooms for you. Now, I still have the die-cut rocks and some leaves, along with that die-cut mushroom from the stamp set, those small mushrooms. Those are what gave us this, our thank you card. I went ahead and I fussy cut the white border from the mushrooms. It was a little tedious, but worth it. I arranged those with the 2 rocks, the medium ground cover, and 2 leaves into this pleasing arrangement. I masked off a 2¼ inch by 3½ inch area in the center of an A2 white card panel, and I ink blended green apple, lemon drop, and splash reactive inks for a nice ombre background. I die cut that panel with a 2¾ inch by 4 inch Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die, and I added a thin black mat behind that before gluing it to the front of an A2 white card base. Now, I did the blending on the die cuts straight with my Pebbles chalk palette. I love the blending on these leaves. That may be my favorite way to add some simple shading to die cuts. Something like a little pastel chalk to give you some soft color. I stamped the sentiment, that's the last one in the stamp set, with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. Embossed that with clear embossing powder. I glued the die cuts and the mushrooms in place and used a touch of foam tape behind the smaller leaf in front. I love that the leaves seem to be protecting the mushrooms, or at least shading them. That gives some great context for a very pretty thank you card. At this point, I have used every stamp in the stamp set, every fancy die in our die set, except for the heart. That heart right there, that's the last thing I need to use. And so this one's just for you guys, well, and me, of course. But for our last card this month, we've got, I find you quite riveting. There we go. I'm feeling back to form with this terrific little pun. Now, I still had that frog stamped on some Stonehenge white cardstock, so I colored him up with my colored pencils and fussy cut him out. I got rid of the leaf that he was holding, but I kept the stem. Now, the frog fits perfectly on top of that die-cut rock. Now, I was going to stamp and die-cut the heart, but I realized that the die cut alone makes for a perfect heart, so I die cut the heart from the poppy cardstock in the kit. I glued the frog to the rock and the heart to the stem. I die cut a scrap of white cardstock with a 1½ by 2 inch, that's approximate, Spellbinders Deco Rectangles die. I only have 5 of these, so there's 5 limited sizes. That's why I bought the paper trimmer. I did ink blend some of the Forest Moss Distress Oxide ink around the edges. And then one more time, I used my Silhouette software and the Footlights MT light font to print this sentiment on a white card panel. And then I die cut that to 2¾ inches by 4 inches with a Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle die. I added a thin dark green mat behind that before gluing both to the white card base. I added the decal rectangle with foam tape and glued the images in place with a scrap of cardstock behind the top of the frog to keep him level and a touch of foam tape behind the heart. A couple of clear dots highlight the sentiment, and a clear heart dot is in the center of the heart. I admit I do love that frog stamp. And this is a terrific, lovingly punny sentiment. I find you quite riveting. Rivet, rivet. And that covers my 10 cards for the month. I really had a good time working with this kit. I think the terrarium concept is fun and unique, and the stamps and dies are detailed and quite adorable. I really like that the frog stamp is a little more realistic than cartoony. He actually looks a little grumpy. I'm always trying to create cards that go a little bit beyond what the design team shows us, and that hopefully gives you some new ideas about using the supplies. I did manage to use all the stamps, all the fancy dies on these 10 cards. Let me know which ones are your favorite. My only reservation about this kit is that the stamps and fancy dies are pretty similar. You've got a tree stump stamp and a tree stump die cut. You've got a mushroom stamp and a mushroom die cut. You've got pothos stamps and pothos die cuts. You get the idea. Not to mention that you have to use the dome and the base fancy dies to make a stamped aquarium. That's a little crossover there. And I did wish for more critters than just a frog, and a butterfly. Those are minor quibbles with what I found to be a delightful kit. I don't know, maybe Hero Arts is just trying to appeal to both the stampers and the die cutters this month. So you can pick up this April 25 card kit of the month by subscribing to the Hero Studio card kit of the month through April 27th. If there are any leftovers after then, they will become available beginning the 20th of May, next month. So I guess that wraps things up this month. If you enjoyed this post and these cards, please click the thumbs up at the top of the page. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Let me know which cards are your favorite. And remember to like me, list me, pin me, post me, share me with all of your crafty friends. Remember, don't run with scissors. And as always, I send you and yours love and light and happy crafting. For more detailed information, better pictures, and product links, please visit my website at cardcutups.com.